Great. Let's move to you, Myroslava. And Myroslava is famous for researching the soft power of Ukraine. She's studied, and I think she's working on a doctorate from Oxford, as I recall. And she ran an art salon in Kyiv, one of my favorite places to go, the Triptych Gallery. And Myroslava really has her finger on the cultural pulse of where Ukrainians' heads are. So if you could take it from here, Myroslava.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that introduction. Well, our gallery has been closed, unfortunately, since the pandemic hit, and I don't see it reopening anytime soon, given the current situation. I don't think luxury retail is very much on everyone's minds. But I do hope to share some insights that I've gained from the past 8 years of my time in Ukraine. Because I have such a limited time, I can't really go into all the different amazing things that have been happening in Ukraine's culture over the past years. So instead, I wanted to offer 3 main narratives that we've seen emerge in Ukrainian culture at large. So this is everything from pop music to urban design to the visual arts, whether in cinema, music video production, or indeed the fine arts. Well, the first one is that we have certainly seen a change in Ukraine's relationship to its Soviet past. There has been a tendency in recent years, especially among the Ukrainian cultural elite of the new generation, to embrace certain aspects of Soviet heritage. So on the left, we see a Soviet mosaic from the 70s. From Prospect Peremohi. There is a whole line of very distinctive Soviet panel buildings with these elaborate mosaic decorations. One of them has fallen under a lot of criticism, not this one, because it shows the coat of arms of the USSR in a very kind of elaborate, colorful, psychedelic interpretation. On the right, this is a contemporary artist and fashion designer, Yulia Bilaeva, and she has indeed designed a line of swimwear which takes images of Ukrainian Soviet mosaics. Following the Euromaidan, there was a process of the destruction of Soviet monuments that we've seen many Lenin statues overturned, and this was known as the Lenin Fall. And there was a general impression that Soviet aesthetics were very unwelcome, but because there's such an important fiber, such an important thread in the urban fiber in Ukraine, in the capital, as well as really all over the country, including Lviv, there is some fantastic Soviet monumental art in Lviv. There has been a kind of move towards embracing those aesthetics as a kind of important part in the development of Ukraine. Having said that, choosing to protect monumental artworks by essentially Ukrainian artists who were commissioned during the Soviet period to carry out these works does not mean that this younger generation of Ukrainians are aligning themselves with the ideology of the Soviet Union. So there's been this huge divorce between aesthetics and ideology. We embrace the aesthetics insofar as it's not actual insignia of the Soviet state, but we certainly distance ourselves from the ideology. So in fact, seeing these aesthetics as part of new cultural products has been a way of kind of processing that past. Another thing which we've seen recently is that feminist ideas and ideas about the human body, and in particular the female body, have really entered the mainstream discourse in Ukraine. And on the left is a very famous painting by Taras Shevchenko, the national poet of Ukraine, Ukraine's Shakespeare. In many ways, Ukraine's Thomas Jefferson too, because of course he carried his works, his poetry and prose carried a lot of political ideas on the foundation of the Ukrainian national state. This is his own painterly illustration to the poem Katerina, which tells the story of the downfall of a Ukrainian girl who gave her heart to a Cossack, seen in the background, getting away from her and leaving her pregnant, and of course, alienated from the community. On the left is a recent performance by a Ukrainian artist, Alice DeLuna, who in fact spent just under a decade studying in the UK, and she chose, like me, to come back to Ukraine after the Euromaidan, after the revolution. So we see two very different examples of Ukrainian women with a very, very different cultural context, and of course, a different relationship to their own body. This is significant because in many ways, the rise of women's rights and of feminist ideas has helped a lot of Ukrainians to redefine the way they see not only personal relationships, but also political relationships. Ukraine's relationship to Russia can, in many ways, be seen in terms of a codependent, abusive relationship that Ukraine is trying to distance herself from. Of course, Ukraine is conceptualized very much as female, as a woman, as a feminine entity. In Putin's recent speech, he quoted the popular adage, whether нравится, не нравится, терпимая красавица. So like it or not, you're going to have to put up with it, beauty. And of course, this was something that President Zelensky responded to, saying, that this was not the kind of language that Ukraine was going to put up with anymore. And this is very important because, of course, just as Ukraine sees Russia in terms of historic abuse and oppression, Russia very much sees Ukraine as the unwilling but legitimate spouse of Russia. Another important change that we've seen is the evolution of the cultural diplomatic policy of the Ukrainian state. So on the left, we have the famous Spirit of Ukraine statue that decorates the Euromaidan, probably one of the images of Ukrainian women that has been most widely televised around the world, because of course the protests unfolded around this column celebrating Ukrainian statehood, and it's executed in a very throwback style of kind of Ukrainian Cossack neo-Baroque. So there's a lot of gold, there are a lot of folk elements, obviously, and there is a very retro, retro, we're talking 17th, 18th century retro aesthetic. So very much looking towards the past and trying to give Ukraine a chance to re-establish herself historically as well as aesthetically. And of course, on the right, many of you will recognize Goe's Shum video. This is the song with which they didn't win the Eurovision Song Contest last year, but they, I think, were the most memorable act by a mile. And we're seeing a very, very different kind of image of Ukraine that has been sanctioned by the Ukrainian state. So it's countercultural, it's fun, it's militaristic, it's steampunk, it's kind of Ukrainian Matrix on steroids in Chernobyl. And of course, the song itself drew inspiration from Ukrainian folklore. It's a so-called Vesnyanka, or spring chant, that was meant to draw in harvest. So again, folkloric themes, but interpreted very differently. If on the left, we have a very literal interpretation, on the right, we have something very fluid, very modern, and arguably something that has a wide appeal. So it's not, strictly speaking, it's not just meant for national consumption. It's something that is legible globally amongst a new generation of culture lovers. I very much agree with Brian's remark regarding the fact that there is now a generation of Ukrainians who remember neither a Soviet past nor a time when we were Russia by extension, in the sense that we consumed most of the cultural product that we consumed, whether that was TV or films or music, was Russian. They very much are living in a Ukrainian society where Ukraine is as widely spoken in even the most Russian-speaking parts. I think Ukrainian is as widely spoken now in the public realm. That is really, I think, the backbone of the new cultural product, because culture is becoming increasingly younger, and even the interpretation of cultural giants such as Shevchenko is increasingly younger. And lastly, to conclude, I think it's very important to realize that Russia and Ukraine have diametrically opposed cultural paradigms. The fact that Ukraine has a distinct culture in the eyes of Russia does not mean that Ukraine deserves state sovereignty. Russia is a federation. It includes essentially thousands of ethnic groups with their own very distinct cultures and languages in many cases. And that, as far as Russia is concerned, is not an argument. You could also argue that Kyiv has a more important place, or as important a place in Russian history as does Moscow in Ukraine's history, because of course this is where the medieval city-state that was the Kyiv Rus originated. The Ukrainian urban fabric contains buildings of very different historical periods. This is St. Andrew's Church. It was designed by an Italian architect, built by a Russian architect, and of course it absorbed influences from Ukrainian Cossack Baroque, and it is a global landmark, but it is of course a Ukrainian church, but it has so many ties, and like really the best examples of Ukrainian urban culture, it's very cosmopolitan in its outlook. So my closing thought, of course, is that we see the kind of coverage that Ukraine is receiving now. I would say, I mean, Peter would probably be able to comment on this more authoritatively, but I would argue that the Ukraine crisis is much, much more prominent than the Euromaidan was. The reason being, Russia is the antagonist. Russia has the leading role still. People still see Ukraine in terms of its relationship to Russia. And the fact that Ukraine has a distinct culture does not necessarily help Russia to put this abusive codependent relationship in the past, even though I think Ukraine is more than ready to do this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Myroslava. Very interesting. And her gallery is just to the left of that beautiful church, which went through it's a lovely restoration. And whoever goes to Kyiv should definitely go see it. St. Andrews. And just to put a nail on the head, many people would say that Putin's comments last week was the language of a rapist, essentially. I mean, it's someone who wants to force himself on someone else in a male-female setting. And to quantify the Lenin fall, which is a fascinating phenomenon. And Myroslava, I remember at your gallery, you hosted that Swiss photographer who traveled around the country, and he did a book documenting many of the 1,300 Lenin statues that have been taken down in Ukraine in the last 8 years. And some of them are like holding up carports, and some of them are in the basements of museums. Some of them are just face down in a flower bed. But it's been a thoroughgoing sort of purging of Lenin. The only two Lenin statues still standing are in Chernobyl, which is maintained as kind of a Soviet theme park for largely foreign tourists, an hour and a half north of Kyiv, and hopefully the Russian troops will not come through there. On that note, Myroslava, about Russian troops, there is this phenomenon. Kyiv can be called the largest Russian-speaking city outside of Russia. You and I, all of us know it's a bilingual city, increasingly bilingual, and just about everybody in Kyiv speaks Ukrainian. And for many, it's their first language, if not most. Why do you think that Putin cannot understand the concept of the Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriot?
Well, as I mentioned, if the existence of this distinct language and a distinct culture was recognized as the sole basis for sovereignty, then that would herald the end of Russia as a federal state, because there are so many distinct cultures and distinct languages within the Russian Federation.